Our scriptures this morning, truth be told, my very favorite parable that Jesus ever told. And it comes from, as we close our series on the parables of Jesus, I saved the best one for last. It comes from the 15th chapter of the Gospel of Luke. And Jesus says this in verse 11, to illustrate the point further, Jesus told them this story. A man had two sons. The younger son told his father, I want my share of your estate from you now before you die. So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land. And there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, at home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant. So he returned home to his father, and while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. But his father said to the servants, quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet, and kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead and is now returned to life. He was lost, but now he's found. So the party began. Meanwhile, the older son was in the fields working. When he returned home, he heard music and dancing in the house, and he asked one of the servants what was going on. Your brother is back, he was told, and your father has killed the fattened calf. We're celebrating because of his safe return. The older brother was angry and wouldn't go in. His father came out and begged him, but he replied, all these years I've slaved for you and never once refused to do a single thing you told me to do. And in all that time, you never even gave me one young goat for a feast with my friends. Yet when this son of yours comes back after squandering your money on prostitutes, you celebrate by killing the fattened calf. His father said to him, look, dear son, you have always stayed by me, and everything I have is yours. We had to celebrate this happy day, for your brother was dead and has come back to life. He was lost, but now he's found. When I was much younger, in college, my college days, my buddy and I had a radio show at George Fox. We had a radio station at George Fox called K-Fox. And we didn't really have a real wide listening audience. We weren't viral, as they say now. We had a dedicated few that would listen occasionally. But because we didn't really have an audience, we were allowed to pretty much pick whatever content and say whatever we wanted to and play whatever songs we wanted to play. And we didn't have to go by any playlists or anything like that. And so we had a lot of fun, whether anyone was listening or not. And one of my favorite songs that we played every time I was in the DJ booth was a song by a band, I can't even remember their name. They were a one-hit wonder back in the early 90s. But the name of the song always stuck with me because the song was called Jeffrey Dahmer Went to Heaven. Now keep in mind, this was the early 90s. Everyone knew more than they wanted to about Jeffrey Dahmer. Now, most of you, as I can tell, recall who Jeffrey Dahmer was. If you don't know or can't remember, Jeffrey Dahmer was a serial killer that lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, and killed 17 people. He was also a cannibal. He was, by all accounts, the epitome of a monster, an evil man. What most people don't know is that after he was sentenced to 956 years in prison for his crimes, he asked the warden of the prison if the warden would send someone to teach him about the Bible. As you can imagine, there weren't a lot of takers, except for one. A preacher by the name of Roy Radcliffe, who lived in Madison, filled out the form and went in and saw Jeffrey Dahmer and began to teach him the Bible, starting with the gospel. Jeffrey wrestled with what he heard, clearly. Could God forgive someone even as monstrous and evil as himself? After years of meeting with Radcliffe, Jeffrey Dahmer gave his life to Christ and was baptized. Shortly thereafter, he was beaten to death by another prison inmate. And when news was broadcast that Jeffrey Dahmer had died in prison at the hands of another inmate, no one shed a tear. I didn't. What comes around goes around. All of which begs the question of the song. How far is the reach of grace? Can monsters like Jeffrey Dahmer ever really, truly find redemption? And if they do, what will your reaction be when you see Jeff in heaven? As we close our series on the parables, I realize Ed preached on the parable son when I was gone, so I'm not going to steal his thunder. However, I couldn't end this series without talking about this parable because in some ways I think I have a different take on this parable than a lot of how I grew up hearing it. And the first thing I would start with is, as we've learned about parables, right, the first thing you want to find out is who is the primary audience. That is, does the Gospels tell us who's in the room that Jesus is speaking to? Because who's in the room dictates a lot of the meaning of the story. And then you have your secondary audience, which are the people that are not present but who hear it later. And when you hear a parable later, that's the power of parables, right? They invite you to say, who am I in this story? This is not, as it is famously known, the parable of the prodigal son. It is the parable of the elder brother. We put all our attention, all our focus on the prodigal son. But what you're going to see this morning is that Jesus takes this story and he extends it to drive home the point to the audience that he is primarily talking to, which were the Pharisees and teachers of the law, who happened to be in the room with his disciples and a bunch of sinners. I don't know how they got the invitation. I know how Jesus gets the invitation. All kinds of sinners and people wanted to have Jesus come over. He was the only rabbi that would grace their doorstep. And they loved what he had to say. So I know how the disciples and Jesus and the sinners got in to the meal, to the feast. But you ever go somewhere and then people just show up and you're wondering, like, who invited this guy? Like, does anybody know him? Is this a wedding crasher? I think that's what happens here because it's and we see this also a reoccurring theme that when Jesus would have dinner, the Pharisees and the teachers would show up not to be a part of the proceedings, but simply to observe and judge and get Jesus to say something that they could use against him, because surely no rabbi worth his salt would spend time with people of such notorious sin. So we need to understand, if we're going to understand the parable, the setting. This is a mixed crowd. But Jesus knows what's in the heart. He knows why the Pharisees are there. And he knows why the sinners are there. And so he tells 3 stories. This is the third of the 3. He tells 3 stories to illustrate the joy that God has when the lost are found. And he starts by telling them the story. He says, okay, let me tell you a story. There's a shepherd who has 100 sheep, and one lamb wanders off. But he's a good shepherd, and so he leaves the 99 in search of the one that is lost. And when he finds the lamb that was lost, he carries him on his shoulders home and calls all the other shepherds out and says, rejoice with me, because the lamb that was lost has been found. Now understand what a ridiculous story that is. On purpose. I don't know a lot of herdsmen, I don't know a lot of farmers that would look at that and go, that's what I'd do. I'd leave the 99 healthy flock unprotected for an unknown period of time to go look, hopefully, for a lamb that is wounded or lost or injured that maybe I might find. There's a chance. Meanwhile, there's a really good chance that the 99 are going to wander off themselves or become prey for predators. A lot of people would hear that story and go, that's crazy. It's just called the cost of doing business. When you raise animals, you lose a few. That's just how it goes. What shepherd in his right mind would leave the 99? And Jesus says, God does. Not because he's greedy and he just can't stand the thought of losing one sheep, but because the sheep is lost. It could be injured. And that love drives him more than concern for the 99 that are safe. The people at the table, they get that story. They recognize that lost sheep is them. The Pharisees say this is a fool. So Jesus tells a second story. He says there's a woman who's sweeping her house. And in sweeping her house, she finds a valuable coin that she thought was lost. And when she finds the coin, she gathers the coin and gathers all her friends around and says, rejoice with me, celebrate with me. This coin that I thought I'd lost, I found. He says, and that's what it's like in heaven whenever a sinner turns back to the Lord. Rejoice. And everybody at the table kind of goes, well, I get that. I can see that. And then Jesus takes it a final step, because the Pharisees, they really don't get it yet. And he tells this parable of 2 sons. Jesus is showing through these stories very clearly that those who are lost are not worthless or to be despised, but are deeply treasured by God. God has a heart for lost souls. Aren't you glad? Amen. So Jesus tells these two parables, and then this is how we know he's making the final point. Verse 11 says, to illustrate the point further, he's told two parables. Jesus told them this story. A man had two sons. So who do you think at the table is in need of further explanation? The sinners are already going, yeah, we love this story. The sheep, the coin, yeah. It's the skeptics. It's the Pharisees. It's the one who thinks God doesn't work like that. God has a heart for the holy, not the profane. And we are the holy. Jesus tells what would have been an absolutely scandalous story. I mean, scandalous story. You have to understand that Israel is a shame and honor-based culture. It was then, it continues in many ways to be now. But certainly in Jesus' day, it was a shame and honor-based culture. And we struggle with that because it's really not how we're wired as Americans. In the law, in the Old Testament, you were actually allowed, if your children dishonored you, the father was allowed to take the child basically to court, to the council of elders of that town or village, and if found guilty, they could put the son to death by stoning. Worked great for reining in teenagers. Didn't happen very often. But that was in the law because of honor. Like Moses wasn't kidding when he said, children, honor your father and mother, and it will go well for you. Don't and find out, right? This is an honor and shame-based culture. There's an ancient Asian legend, also an honor and shame-based culture, that kind of gives us an insight into this mentality. There's a story of a man who had a wild and impetuous son. The boy became involved with ruffians of the village who persuaded him to join them in a robbery of his father's own treasury house. After the robbery was over, his friends fled with the stolen treasure and left him to face the guilt of the crime alone. The young man was desperate. He was deserted by his friends and he had betrayed the trust of his father. But his greatest crime was that he had brought public dishonor on the family name, and in a culture where ancestors are worshipped and family integrity is a sacred trust, this was the worst wrong of all. Broken and deeply repentant, he went to his father and begged forgiveness. Graciously, it was granted. The father called all of the members of the family together to celebrate the reconciliation and return of his son. When all had enjoyed the banquet to the fullest, the father stood and lifted his cup of rice wine for a toast. But as the son drank deeply the contents of his cup, he grabbed his throat and fell lifeless across the table. The son had been poisoned. The father, with ceremonial dignity, nodded to the guests. Each in turn graciously and politely bowed to the father as they silently left the banquet hall. All was now put right. The son had paid the price of his pardon with poison. His honor had been restored. The family integrity and honor were reestablished. The unfortunate incident was now closed. In the parable of the prodigal son, another father is deeply shamed by his son's wild and reckless behavior, but when that son comes back and begs forgiveness, what a different reaction he gets. But that is the mentality of the people Jesus is telling this story to. So let's dive into the story a little bit. For whatever reason, we don't really know why, this second son, who in their family would not have had a position of honor, being the second son, he's kind of like Prince Harry, right, in the royal family. He got to do something to make a name for himself. He has no position of honor or real power in the family, and so he goes to his father and he tells him basically this: "You are dead to me. I wish you would just die already and give me my inheritance. How much better would my life be if you didn't exist?" That's what he's saying. And the father agrees. What would your reaction be if one of your children came to you and said, "You are dead to me. I want nothing to do with you or this family ever again"? How would you handle it? But what does the father do? He cuts his flocks and herds and sells them, giving the money to this ungrateful son of his, and sends him on his way with his blessing. Understand, he didn't just dip into his savings account or raid his 401k. He's a farmer. He cut the herds. Do you know what that does to a rancher, to a herdsman? To cut your herds like that so dramatically? Do you know how long that would have set the family farm back? A decade, maybe? So the son gets his flock, he sells it, he takes the money, and he goes to a foreign land. And like all prodigals, he blows it on wine and women, right up until famine strikes the land that he's living in, and he's forced to take a job slopping pigs. He's a Jew. Jews hate pigs. They don't raise pigs. They don't eat pigs. They think pigs are horrible, dirty animals. And if you've ever raised pigs, you would agree with them. Although bacon is really good. Yet here is this Jew in a foreign land forced to completely debase himself just to survive. Until one day in his desperation he hatches a plan. He is already struck rock bottom. And that provides the inertia to grasp onto any plan, no matter how crazy. And he decides this: I'm going home. He will look for his father's forgiveness and offer to work just as a hired hand, denounce his sonship. At least then he won't die of starvation. But a funny thing happens on the way home. He doesn't make it. You see, his father has been on the lookout from the day he left. He sees his son from afar and debases himself by running willy-nilly down the road toward him. And before the son can even start his well-rehearsed sales pitch, he is engulfed in the loving embrace of his father. And before he can even finish his apology, the father is calling for the finest robe and new sandals and a ring to be put on his finger. And oh, by the way, kill the fattened calf, we're having a party. Why? It's simple, really. The son who he thought was dead is alive after all. And the one who was lost has come home. Now, if Jesus is holding true to the previous parables, if he's holding true to the first parables that he told about this would be where the story ends, right? All the other parables end with, and then there was a big party. But the story doesn't end, does it? Because that's not what the parable's about. In the story, the older brother, the one with the most honor in the family and the position of greatest leadership, hears the commotion as he's coming in from the fields and asks one of the servants what's going on. He's less than thrilled with the answer. This brother, who brought shame on their father and on their family, wanders back home, and this is the reception he gets. He's so mad he refuses to enter the tent. That is incredibly dishonoring to his father. His father asks him to come in. He says no. So what does the father do? He gets up and he goes out to his other son. He debases himself again, dishonors himself. He's not playing have we figured out at this point the father doesn't give two bits about honor? He just loves his sons. And so he goes to talk to the elder son, and he reminds the son that he has always been with him and that everything that he has is his. And he stresses the fact that this brother, the one that everyone thought had perished, who was beyond hope, has returned to the family, and that single fact alone is worth rejoicing over. Now, we said, we already identified the room, right? It's Jesus' disciples, it's some sinners, and it's some Pharisees. This last part, remember the power of parables? Where do you think they read themselves into the story? They still think the elder brother was right. And they missed the point entirely. But they aren't the only hearers of this story, are they? Because we too must ask ourselves the question, who are we in this story? And I'll tell you something, I think it changes over time. Early in our faith, early in our lives, we see and we find our identity in the prodigal. But sometimes as we walk in faith for longer and longer, it gets easier and easier to identify with the older brother. We spend more and more time with people like us who hold similar values and have less and less in common with the prodigal sons and daughters. How many Christians, honestly, would have been happy if Jeffrey Dahmer had never met Reverend Radcliffe? Some of you who are parents might read this parable differently now. Maybe you've been through something similar, prodigal sons and daughters who have written you off until they need money. Do you see yourself through the lens of the Father? Doesn't he know, this Father, that prodigals never really change? Or do they? Here's the sequel to the story. It's not in the Bible, so don't look for it. This is my sequel to the story. Almost 5 years to the day after he returned home the first time, the prodigal son emptied his bank account, packed a few changes of clothes, and snuck off for the faraway country again. The first year back, he was just glad to be home. The second year was toughest. He still couldn't get rid of the shame that chewed away at his soul. The third year, things leveled out a little. He started feeling more at home, back in sync with his former life. The fourth year, certain things began to irk him. His old itches longed to be scratched. And the fifth year, it happened. Allurements came knocking, rapping their knuckles on his heart's front door. And so the prodigal relapsed, re-sinned, re-destroyed his life. You know him or her. Maybe it's your best friend. Maybe it's your child. Or maybe it's you. The thing you swore you'd never do again, you did it last night. You left the straight and narrow. Prodigals have a way of finding themselves right back in the pigsty. In that moment, heaven and hell contend for you. Hell shouts, "Now you've gone and done it. You stupid piece of garbage. You're a lost, lonely, hopeless cause. You're a pig, and that's all you'll ever be." But there's another voice. It's the voice of heaven. The familiar lilt of a dad's voice echoing down the long hallways of hope, down to the deepest, darkest caverns of your pain. He doesn't accuse. He doesn't berate. He only mouths two simple words of heaven's redemptive love. Come home. The second time, the third time, the 1,000th time, he will sprint to meet you down the street, throw his arms around you, kiss you, and command the fattened calf to be slaughtered. The father is standing on the porch, his hand shading the sun from his eyes, scanning the horizon for the familiar image of the one who will forever remain his precious, beloved child. Come home. If today you hear this story and you say, "That's me. I'm the prodigal," then I have 4 words for you. Stop running. Come home. Whatever sin, whatever addiction, whatever fear is keeping you from embracing the God who died for you, understand that he knows you full well and would do it again in a heartbeat if it meant that you would return. If today you hear the story and you fear that you might be the elder brother, I encourage you to remember from whence you came. You too, at one point, were running from God. You came home. But your attitude towards those who haven't is brittle and hard. Know that today, this story was then and is now for you. If you can't find it in your own heart to rejoice, then at least rejoice with the God in heaven who is throwing a party every time a lost sinner comes home. And if today you hear the story and say, "I feel more like the scorned father," don't give up hope. For some, it takes one time. for others 1,000. But don't give up hope. No matter how broken and wounded they are, deep down inside, they all crave home. Amen.